It's the United States versus the entire world. And this is who would actually win in 2026. In any modern war, you don't win by running straight at the enemy. You win by controlling the sky. And this is where the United States plays its best card. The war wouldn't start with soldiers marching across borders. It would start with a massive air raid that covers the whole globe. The US Air Force has spent years perfecting the art of the first day of war. They don't just fight the enemy. They shatter its ability to fight back before the war even begins. In 2026, the US is bringing some serious heat, with over 13,000 aircraft ready to go. The rest of the world comes equipped with over 39,000. That is 3 enemy aircraft for every 1 American. Most of the rest of the world is flying aging aircraft, planes that belong in museums, not in a modern-day war, especially when they're coming up against 5th-generation fighters, including the 400 F-35 Lightning IIs and nearly 200 F-22 Raptors. They are snipers in the sky, spotting enemy aircraft from miles away, firing and turning for home before the enemy even sees a dot on the radar. But stealth alone isn't the real advantage. The real edge is integration. US forces are able to fight on a single shared network. Aircraft, ships, drones, tanks, and infantry all exchange data in real time. A sensor in the air can cue a strike from the sea. A drone can pass a target directly to artillery hundreds of miles away. This means the United States doesn't fight as separate branches. It fights as one complete system. And that is something most of the world can't do. Coalition forces rely on incompatible radio, software, and command structures. In peacetime, that's manageable, but in combat, it's a deadly problem. The F-35 is the best example of this. It isn't just a fighter, it is a flying sensor and electronic warfare platform. It can detect threats, jam enemy radars, and pass targeting data to ships, missiles, and other aircraft. The F-35 doesn't even have to fire a shot. The rest of the military can do it. But the F-35's real value is what it does for everything around it. Friendly units become more lethal simply by being connected to it. That kind of force multiplication is hard to counter, especially for militaries that still fight as separate parts instead of a unified whole. Running defense for the rest of the world is mainly on Russia and China. Russia has about 4,000 aircraft, and China has around 3,200. Sure, they have their own versions of stealth fighters like the Su-57 and the J-20, but there is not enough of them to make a difference. Plus, their engines break down a lot more often. It's a classic case of quality beating quantity. But the world has a different plan. They throw thousands of older fighters at the US all at once. Their plan isn't to be better, their plan is to be everywhere. They also field the deadliest air defense systems on Earth. Russia's S-400 and China's HQ-9 create massive no-fly bubbles over Europe and Asia, systems designed specifically to hunt American aircraft. So how would the first week of the war look? The US launches a wave of B-2 Spirits and new B-21 Raiders. These bombers fly straight into the middle of enemy territory, undetected to enemy radar. The US targets enemy command centers, radar stations, and runways. At the same time, thousands of US drones flood the skies. They act as bait, forcing enemy radar systems to light up, and the moment they do, American missiles take them out. The world fights back hard, though. The skies over Europe and the Pacific turn into a chaotic mess. Despite having better training, the American pilots are outnumbered. For every enemy plane they shoot down, 2 more take its place. In the first few weeks, the US manages to destroy roughly 20 to 30% of the world's air forces. A devastating blow, but it's not without losses. The S-400 systems managed to track and hit American jets, costing the US between 200 and 300 aircraft. By the end of the first phase, the United States controls the skies, but only in specific theaters, the oceans and the Americas. Deep over Russia and China, airspace remains contested. And as US air dominance settles in, the fight shifts to below the surface. The US Navy is not just a navy, it is a floating fortress that can move anywhere in the world. The fleet includes 11 supercarriers, massive ships like the Gerald R. Ford and the Nimitz class. One single US carrier group has more air power than most countries' entire air forces, and the US has 11 of them. The rest of the world has about 10 to 12 combined, depending on how you count light and helicopter carriers. Most of them are smaller, older, or rely on ski jump ramps instead of the powerful catapult systems used by the United States. China has 3 carriers, India has 2, and the rest, the UK, Italy, France, and Japan, are scattered across the globe. In a direct confrontation, they simply cannot compete. And the world knows this. They are not going to sail out to the middle of the Pacific and fight the US Navy fairly. China and Russia focuses on keeping the US away from their coasts. They fill the water near their shores with mines, submarines, and thousands of anti-ship missiles. The biggest threat to the US Navy isn't another ship. It is a missile. China fields hypersonic missiles often called carrier killers. They travel so fast that defeating them is extremely difficult. A single successful hit on an aircraft carrier would be catastrophic, putting thousands of sailors at risk. The U.S. Navy moves to blockade the world, positioning destroyers at ocean's choke points. Global trade grinds to a halt. No oil for China, no food for Europe. The strategy is simple: starve the world until it breaks. This advantage becomes decisive over time. Modern wars aren't won by who strikes the hardest on day one. They become wars of attrition, contests of who can keep moving, feeding, and fueling forces after months of fighting. This is where the U.S. military is strong. American forces can move supplies across the globe at scale. They operate hundreds of aerial refueling aircraft that allow planes to stay airborne for longer. Once shipping lanes collapse and fuel shipments stop, operations slow down, vehicles sit idle, aircraft stay grounded. Numbers stop mattering when armies can't move. U.S. submarines lurk deep underwater, patiently waiting. The Virginia-class attack subs are silent hunters, quieter and more advanced than anything the rest of the world has. They slip into enemy waters and launch attacks on enemy ships. Within the first month, the U.S. Navy sinks roughly 40% of the world's surface fleet. The rest retreat to port, trapped, outmatched, and unwilling to sail. In the South China Sea, a U.S. carrier group gets ambushed. A swarm of Chinese drones and submarines overwhelms the defenses. Torpedoes strike the ships, missiles rain down, 2 or 3 U.S. supercarriers sink. It's a devastating blow to American morale. Despite those losses, the U.S. Navy holds the line. The blockade works, the world's economy starts to crash. Industrial capacity matters just as much as manpower. While much of the world can produce equipment quickly, advanced military systems are far harder to replace. Stealth aircraft, precision weapons, and modern sensors require specialized factories, materials, and skilled labor. The United States has deep reserves of both resources and industrial infrastructure inside North America. Other nations depend on imported oil, metals, and components. Once maritime trade collapses, factories slow down or shut entirely. Over time, one side keeps replacing losses, the other can't. The U.S. rules the deep ocean, but coastal waters remain a death trap, filled with mines. Casualties are high. The U.S. loses 20 to 30 big ships. The world loses over 150. But the U.S. effectively turns the rest of the world into an island, cutting them off from each other. With their navies rusting at the bottom of the ocean, the world has only one option left. After months of bombing and blockades, the world decides they have to invade. They need to take the fight to America, but it is a logistical nightmare. The United States is huge: deserts, mountains, swamps, and forests. It has more than 348 million people, many of them armed. And while this scenario focuses on the military, the presence of an armed population makes any invasion difficult. The world's army is massive, more than 25 million active soldiers combined. China has 2 million alone. The U.S. has about 1.3 million active troops. In a straight-up numbers game, the U.S. gets swamped. However, U.S. soldiers are equipped with better gear, night vision goggles, advanced body armor, and networked radios that link every unit on the battlefield. They fight more effectively at night than their enemies do in the day. And on ground, the M1 Abrams dominates. Its active protection systems can intercept incoming rockets before they ever hit the tank. Numbers alone don't decide ground wars. Training and initiative matter just as much. Most U.S. troops have years of preparation and experience operating complicated hardware. They're trained to adapt when things go wrong. Most opposing forces rely on short-term conscription, with soldiers sometimes receiving only weeks of training before combat. Command structures are rigid, so when officers are killed or communications fail, units often collapse. U.S. forces operate differently. If a leader goes down, the next person takes over. In chaotic battles, that keeps formations fighting while less adaptable forces freeze. The world attempts to invade on 2 fronts, through Mexico in the south and Canada in the north. Massive armies land on U.S. beaches, but the U.S. doesn't try to stop them at the shoreline. That fight favors the attacker. Instead, the enemy is allowed to push inland, their supply lines stretched thin. Then the counterattacks begin. U.S. artillery rains precision rockets on the enemy fuel trucks and ammo dumps. Without gas, the enemy tanks stop moving. Without ammunition, enemy soldiers can't fight. The U.S. utilizes its speed, hitting weak points with fast-moving units, then disappearing before the enemy can respond. But sheer numbers begin to tell. World forces rack up massive losses, pushing forward in waves, relying on bodies where logistics fail. The battle for the U.S. homeland turns cities to ruins. The fighting happens street by street. U.S. drones hover over neighborhoods, sniping enemy combatants. Eventually, the sheer weight of the world's armies begins to push the U.S. back. Alaska may be overrun. Forces may push into Texas, but taking ground is one thing, holding it is another. American supply lines are short, fought on home territory. The world's supply lines stretch across oceans, and the U.S. Navy is actively sinking its ships. Food and fuel begin to run out. The advance stalls. Morale follows survivability. U.S. forces invests heavily in battlefield medicine, aiming to move wounded soldiers to advanced care within the golden hour. Troops know that they have a chance of survival if injured during battle. Other armies can't offer that assurance. Medical evacuation is slower, supplies are limited, and wounded soldiers are often left behind. Over time, this erodes morale. Units surrender not because they're destroyed, but because hope disappears. The world has the numbers to take over land, but they cannot break the U.S. military completely. The U.S. Army inflicts roughly 5 million casualties. American losses climb to around 500,000. It's a brutal meat grinder, but the homeland remains largely secure, protected by geography and the advantage of fighting at home. And it becomes a bloody stalemate. And for the side that's losing, desperation sets in. If the U.S. believes it is truly losing, if enemy armor is rolling toward Washington, D.C., the rules change. The United States maintains what's known as the nuclear triad, the ability to launch nuclear weapons from land, sea, and air. Hundreds of missiles sit in hardened silos across the Midwest. They are old systems but reliable. 14 ballistic missile submarines patrol the oceans. Each carries enough firepower to erase an entire nation. Then there are the nuclear-capable bombers standing ready, able to strike from the air. Of course, the world has nukes too. Russia has the most, over 5,400 warheads in military stockpiles. China is building faster, reaching about 600. But beyond those two, the numbers fall off. France, the UK, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea each possesses far smaller arsenals. But the real problem isn't weapons, it's coordination. Nuclear war depends on timing, communication, and command. And all of that depends on visibility. Satellites guide missiles, drones, logistics, and communications. In 2026, space is a battlefield. Cyber attacks can disrupt civilian life everywhere, but militaries are the real target. The U.S. operates on hardened, redundant networks designed to keep functioning even under attack. Forces that lose situational awareness don't just fight worse, they fight blind, and blind armies bleed fast. That matters because hesitation is dangerous. Someone has to fire first. And if those launches aren't synchronized, U.S. missile defenses come into play. Those systems can intercept a limited number of warheads in space. They might stall a small attack, but they can't stop a full-scale Russian strike. The United States fights as a single political and military entity. The rest of the world fights as a coalition. Coalitions look powerful on paper, but they fracture under sustained pressure. Different nations have different priorities and threat levels. That affects trust and coordination. Some partners hesitate while others pull back entirely. The U.S. doesn't face that problem, it adapts and keeps fighting as one. That's why attempts to limit the conflict don't work. Let's say the world tries to use a small tactical nuke to destroy a U.S. Army base. The U.S. response would be instant and huge. U.S. submarines launch their missiles, and within minutes, the capitals of every major enemy nation are targeted. But Russia has a dead hand system that would automatically launch their missiles at the U.S. China would fire too. The result is mutually assured destruction. There is no winner. The United States may survive slightly longer, mainly because its submarines are the hardest part of the nuclear force to eliminate, guaranteeing retaliation even if the homeland is destroyed. But at this stage, victory no longer matters. Once full-scale nuclear exchange begins, everyone loses. The planet enters nuclear winter and civilization does not survive. So who wins doesn't depend on firepower, it depends on whether the war stays conventional. If nuclear weapons remain in their silos and the war relies on conventional weapons, guns, planes, and ships, the United States wins. But it's a Pyrrhic victory. The cost is so extreme that it barely resembles winning at all. In the air, the U.S. wins because technology beats numbers. At sea, it wins because carriers and submarines dominate global trade. On the ground, the war stalls. Numbers push back, but logistics break the advance. And in a nuclear war, nobody wins. The United States has built a military designed to fight two major wars at once, but fighting the entire world would push it past the limit. The U.S. could defend its homeland and cripple the global economy with its navy. It could devastate enemy infrastructure from the air, but it could not conquer the world. There simply aren't enough troops to occupy Europe and Asia. And that's why, in a global war, the United States survives, while the rest of the world breaks apart. But if the worst happens, America has options. Check out U.S. World War III plan, or click on this video instead.